CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Now, if 2017 was an eventful year for Africa, 2018 is already set to be even busier. No less than 9 African nations will go to the polls this year, and the tough economic conditions brought about last year are predicted to ease, with growth in Sub-Saharan Africa expected to rise to at least 3.2%. But stability in Africa will still be a major challenge, with groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram still not completely isolated or defeated, and environmental issues like climate change and food security still contributing to the testing conditions experienced across the entire continent. So what should governments and civil society alike be prioritizing in the coming months? And what other expectations are there for Africa in 2018? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. And now to help look ahead at what's in store for Africa this year, I have expert guests standing by in Johannesburg, Dr. Bob Wekesa, postdoctoral fellow at the University of the Witwatersrand, and with me in Nairobi, Professor Michael Chege, Professor of Public Policy and International Development at the University of Nairobi. Thank you both for joining us on Talk Africa. Professor Chege, let me start off with you because before we look at the specifics, I want to get your assessment and thoughts on the trends that you feel will shape Africa in 2018.
I think clearly one of the most important issues that is going to face the continent in this coming year will be how to deal with expanded growth that answers to the problems of youth unemployment. It is not an easy solution to find, but we have to do extra work by country to find what you're going to do to youth. We are the youngest continent in the world. 60% plus of all Africans alive today are under 35. So if you're talking about finding a solution to the problems of economic development of Africa, it is targeting youth. It's about time we had an AU summit at a very high level with the best experts available so that we can deal with this in 2018, so that we begin to get a handle on it.
Right. The economic projections, though, for the continent is projected to rise in 2018, having had a kind of like a downward spiral in 2016, rebounded slightly in 2017, but projected at 3.7 in 2018. Is that going to be sustainable for the continent? Do you see the continent picking up on that?
I think it's going to be sustainable because commodity prices are rising again, and there's increased growth in Europe, in the United States. China is stabilizing somehow, but in general, the commodities markets are going to improve. African countries may have to do something about their internal policies. Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, South Africa have to do something about stabilizing the economies domestically. There are still large deficits in government expenditure that have to be closed, and we have to be worried about that. And the currencies have to be stabilized. The most important issue that I see that we haven't dealt with, again, goes back to agriculture, so that Africa can begin to feed itself and not have the danger of being vulnerable to climate change, and particularly, most important of all, to food insecurity, which affects very ordinary people, not out of their choice, but out of the vagaries of climate change.
Right. Dr. Wekesa, your assessment and thoughts on the trends that you think will be shaping Africa in 2018?
No, I think I'm largely in agreement with Professor Chege, but in addition, I think one of the developments just coming out in recent days has been the indication that the long sought after, common market, free trade area is taking shape, as led by COMESA. So in addition to talk about the rise in commodity prices, which many African countries are heavily reliant on, and in addition to the increased investment or the picking up of investment, foreign direct investments, particularly from outside of the continent into the continent in 2018, one will imagine that a free trade area will actually, lead to increased intra-Africa trade, which will lift the economies and retain actually much of the foreign exchange in the African countries, and therefore serve as an impetus for economic renewal and economic development. I think, we cannot dismiss the fact that China will remain a major player in all this, and other emerging economies, including India, including Turkey, including a Brazil that seems to be again finding its feet. So I think I'm quite optimistic that we will go towards nearly 4% GDP development growth across the continent, but of course with the sterling economies of Ethiopia and places such as Nigeria picking up because of the effect of anti-corruption drive by the president there and so forth. So it's likely that we'll see an upward incline in terms of economic development.
Right. Professor Chege, what we did see, though, in 2017, the major economies on Africa in recession, South Africa and Nigeria, and that did affect the overall growth of the continent. Is that going to pick up?
I think the situation in South Africa will depend a lot on the leadership of the African National Congress. Business, local and international, looking at the performance of the Zuma administration, are clearly disillusioned. If we have a change that's positive there, that will help not just South Africa but the entire region have an uptake in the development of the economy. The thing about Nigeria is that it is so heavily dependent on oil for both government revenue and foreign exchange, and even its subventions that go to county and regional governments, that if oil prices keep the upward mobility in pricing, Nigeria would be okay. And already you're seeing some element of recovery over there. I agree with what Dr. Wekesa is saying, that the anti-corruption strategy adopted by the Buhari government is a positive thing. We should learn a lot, particularly the bigger African countries, including my own country, Kenya, about how to deal with corruption. So much it's been all rhetoric, but very little to show by way of performance, by way of outcome. If we don't want to be seen as a laughing stock of the world, we have to do something about corruption. And that applies to all the bigger economies. The African countries that have low levels of corruption tend actually to be quite small: Botswana, Mauritius, Seychelles, Cape Verde, and Benin. We have to do something in the bigger economies of the continent to mitigate the effects of corruption.
Right. Dr. Wekesa, I do want to come to you with the free trade area as one of the agenda policies that was set by the African Union in 2012, to be exact. Now, the first continental business of the year will be the African Union Summit. What do you see as some of the issues that will be driving the African Union in 2018?
I think one of the key ones is the so-called Kagame report, which will be on the table, which will be on the agenda, I want to imagine, because having been presented in a sense this year. And the Kagame report, in essence, is talk about transformation of the AU and the continent as such. So that in fact, the whole thing is that we need to move away from the dependency syndrome that has afflicted us, so that we kind of can't move unless some outside forces, outside powers, come and nudge us. So, for instance, there's talk of raising resources internally from African countries to meet the peace and security budget, for example, and matters related. So, I think we are watching very closely to see what happens when the AU summit happens. And I think the other matter that one will want to consider is the whole integration process, which is at the heart of the Agenda 2063. Now, I think 2014, we had the first 10-year plan, which ends 2023. And it was very ambitious. But if you take even a very ephemeral or cursory kind of assessment of the implementation of the first 10-year plan of Agenda 2063, it looks like more, sounding very nice on paper, but very little in terms of implementation. So one will imagine that actually the whole integration agenda will actually be focused on a little more stridently with the understanding that we shouldn't just be saying big words like integration of the continent, without actually going to the nitty-gritty and finding out how is integration at the economic level, how many kilometers of roads and railways have we done across borders, how many countries are accepting the African passport to facilitate the movement of people, how much of finance is crossing borders and so forth. So I think those will be the issues that one wants to look at the January event. Right.
Professor Chege, your thoughts?
I think the most important aspects, as Dr. Wekesa has mentioned, what are we going to do about regional common market, regional free trade area, particularly because in the past, the AU summit has said that the regional economic groupings like SADC, East African Community, ECOWAS, Economic Community of Central Africa, have to remove overlapping institutions so that we have an overall integrated single common market. That's going to be very difficult to achieve. I don't know what the Kagame report that he has referred to is going to tell us about how to move towards that direction. It's interesting to look at it, and I think all of us as Africans ought to join the debate on the best ways to accelerate that integration. Having said that, let's say the most important barrier to African movement is, first of all, migration. I'm happy that Kenya is allowing freer movement of Africans in and out of the continent. That is one. Second barrier, lack of communication infrastructure. That includes roads, that includes railways, that includes airways, connecting various African capitals. Again, we hope that the Kagame report, because it has the best African minds, will give us some guidelines in how we move towards that.
Right, gentlemen, we'll stop there for the moment and take a short break. But when we return, we'll have more insights into Africa's expectations for 2018. To stay with us.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington, and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms, and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. We continue our discussion around Africa's expectations for 2018. And I still have my expert guest standing by in Johannesburg, Dr. Bob Wekesa, postdoctoral fellow at the University of the Witwatersrand, and with me in Nairobi, Professor Michael Chege, Professor of Public Policy and International Development at the University of Nairobi. Dr. Wekesa, let me start off there with you on this segment, because we have talked a lot about the economic prospects for the continent, but political prospects as well are there, because there'll be a whole range of elections, including Zimbabwe, South Sudan, DRC, Cameroon, where President Paul Biya is still Africa's longest serving president, and of course Egypt. What are your expectations there?
I think the political situation 2018 seems quite challenging, because if, from the countries we just mentioned, if you look at Madagascar, Egypt, DRC, South Sudan, in an election context, you began, kind of being very cautious of what's likely to happen, because the conflicts there, be they of an ongoing nature or potentially entirely new ones, rear their ugly head. And one therefore has to be very cautious and hope that mechanisms are being put in place such that, electioneering contests that are by their very nature, very competitive, do not let, lead to bloodshed in those countries that might actually worsen the refugee crisis on the continent. I think you mentioned the case of President Paul Biya in Cameroon, who's been in power since 1982. And there's been some restive developments there, where English-speaking Cameroon vis-a-vis Francophone Cameroon are kind of at loggerheads. So one also wants to be very cautious with that. And I think knowing that these very challenging elections coming up in at least 5 of those countries. The African Union needs to put forward its peace building, peacemaking, peace development fit to actually anticipate some of these problems before they occur. And of particular concern is actually South Sudan, which is already, almost 500,000 people have already died, and they are going to elections. What's likely to happen there? So I think mitigating arrangements and acting in advance to forestall possibilities of things going haywire in these countries is of crucial and utmost importance, and I hope the AU Peace and Security Commission is working on that.
Professor Chege, your expectations on that front?
I think the African Union must join hands with local actors and stakeholders who want to see a good, healthy, peaceful transition in those countries. Because I think Bobo Wekesa is right in saying that you cannot really have economic development and growth or even elections in a country where people are still killing one another, or where hundreds of thousands are outside the country as refugees. We have to provide a quick answer to how we can stabilize those countries that are up for elections. I'm particularly concerned about the Democratic Republic of the Congo because of internal instability which seems to be extending, and lack of a consensus on the election and who will be playing part in it, registration of voters, supervision, external monitoring, and deliverance of results. I think the situation is much better in Zimbabwe once the situation is stabilized and stabilizing, because the institutional framework is still intact there. Egypt, we'll wait to see. But Egypt, I would say with Uganda, Rwanda, there are countries where you're going to have elections, but no change in government or rulership. So we have to expect that. But I think, as we said earlier, the trends in Africa of democracy and democratization have been expanding. Most of the larger countries. Some of the problems that arise in that process will be solved by democracy itself. If the Kenyans revisit their constitution and find better ways to promote inclusiveness, they'll have a better election the next time as a result of the crisis that we've just gone through. And that applies to all these other countries. You saw it applying in Senegal a few years ago, and Ghana, and now Nigeria. Right. I believe we move forward.
And that brings us to the question of general security across the continent, because in 2017, the perception was that, terrorism incidents had reduced quite drastically, though. But we still have the issue of Boko Haram in Nigeria. We still have the issue of Al-Shabaab. Despite the end of ISIL, is Africa going to finally get a grip with its terrorism situation in 2018?
To the extent that we have gotten a good grip on terrorism in Africa, fortunately for us, is that we've partnered with international partners in security. United States and the EU in Kenya, for example, and Somalia, UN in Somalia with Amazon, but also in the Sahel, the United States. Don't forget that they were estimating some 10,000 Africans were coming from Iraq after the dissolution of ISIS. These are hard-trained people in the skills of terrorism who are being shipped back to their countries of origin. What effect that is likely to have on the continent is something we need to assess. We were not told which countries they're coming from, or where they're going, or whether they join local militants like Al-Shabaab in in Somalia, and Boko Haram in Nigeria and others, or they start their own independent cells. We don't know. To me, that's a source for worry.
Right, a source of worry still remains terrorism there. Professor Chege, though, if you look at how Africa dealt with its terrorism issue in 2017, what would be the things that would need to change if they were to come to grips with the remaining remnants of terrorism in 2018?
The best way to prevent terrorism is to intervene before it occurs. Then you save lives. I am not quite sure that our intelligence systems and their capacity to monitor beforehand what is likely to happen and to intervene at that stage are as good as they ought to be. Partnering with high-level intelligence acquisition from countries like the US, the EU, all of those with our own neighbors as well, because we tend to talk to each other less as Africans and to exchange intelligence less than we should. If we can upgrade our skills in monitoring terrorism before it occurs, Africans will be happier in 2018. I hope that this can be approved, but it means training. It also requires more political will and more willingness to talk to one another, more willingness to exchange ideas. In Eastern Africa, there has been a little bit of that in the last 2 or 3 years between us and Tanzania and between us and Uganda, Ethiopia. We have to upgrade that trade. Then, after that, we have to understand how to deal with disaster. It is not just terrorism and disaster that occurs in terrorism.
Right.
Practically everything, whether it's bad weather, whether it's collapsing buildings, whether it's collapsing railways, whether it is accidents on the highways. Our countries have shown very little capacity to deal with disaster and disaster management. We must upgrade those skills in 2018 and hope each country comes up with a solution that will serve its people better. Right,
Dr. Wekesa, a few major issues will be coming up in terms of China-Africa relations. Of course, you did mention last year that FOCAC summit that will be held in Beijing, but also the BRICS summit that will be held in South Africa, with South Africa taking over the rotating presidency of the BRICS summit. What should we expect there?
But with respect to FOCAC 7, which will be held in Beijing sometime, I guess, in the last quarter of 2018, one wants to actually urge Africans to put their act together, because as you well know, China does have a policy framework towards Africa. You know, the first one was in 2006, and the second China policy towards Africa was promulgated in 2015 here in Johannesburg. But Africa has not really put together a statement of intent towards China. We do not have a policy framework. Now, we can actually use the documents and the framework such as Agenda 2063 and the Common African Position towards the UN and SDGs. We can use those documents to develop a policy framework that we can then present to China as the statement of intent and what we look to gain from their relations. That being said, I think it will be you know, the FOCAC event will actually be an occasion just to review what has happened and perhaps roll out relations beyond 2018. And I want to imagine that the Maritime Silk Road, you know, the Silk Road agenda will be highly on the agenda. With regards to the BRICS, I think it will be South Africa's turn after the 2013 hosting here. And I suppose that South Africa will actually be flying the African flag and saying, look, we got the BRICS Policy Institute, you know, based right here in Johannesburg. And therefore, South Africa can actually use its presence in the BRICS as an opportunity to raise issues of concern to the BRICS nations as far as Africa is concerned.
Right, Professor Shege, in terms of the China-Africa partnership in 2018, what areas do you think China and Africa could be looking to strengthening their relations, and what areas of cooperation should Africa be seeking in 2018?
I think obviously infrastructure is important. Between Africa and China, there's agreement on that, and we see some good progress taking in place. China delivers infrastructure faster and in better quality than anybody else. And we hope that when the FOCAC summit takes place, some of that will be continued. We have to look seriously at questions like job creation and manufacturing and transformation of African economies from being predominantly agricultural to industrial and job creating, so that we can provide an answer to the question of youth unemployment. I hope this can come up in this summit. But let me say, in addition to that, we in Africa tend to plan less well than we should.
Right, Professor and Dr. Wekesa, we're going to wind up in a moment. I do want to get your closing remarks, Professor. I'll start off with you now. After the prolonged drought in parts of Africa, after the commodities decline, after the growth prospects of 2017, 2018, after the democratic development of 2017, is Africa more looking towards 2018 now on a more stable growth trajectory?
I think they're looking towards 2018 on a positive note. with a positive growth trajectory. It's not going to be stellar. We are not going to be 7 or 8%, which is what you saw in Southeast Asia for a long time. Still, what we don't want to go is have a regress where growth goes into under 5% and or even negative in some areas. We are seeing a positive note of growth. Commodity prices are rising again. It might hurt some countries more than others, but we are also seeing increasingly encouraging notions of manufacturing, like in Ethiopia now. This sort of thing, growth in tourism, service sector, all these are job-creating sectors. We seem to see more and more of that so that we can provide an answer to youth unemployment. Right.
Dr. Wekesa, is Africa's growth outlook looking more stable now going into 2018?
I think I'll agree, yes, that the trajectory is likely to be on an upward trajectory in the sense that commodity prices are picking up now. And, but I think on just that note, in the last, for example, discussion between Africa and China, there was talk of beneficiation, and also value addition to our products. Having learned from the slump in commodity prices in the 2015-2016 period, one wants to imagine that African countries will do well to actually use this coming boom, if the predictions are anything to go by, to use the coming boom to kind of up their game in terms of value addition and going towards manufacturing rather than and processing of the natural resources rather than shipping them in raw form to other countries out of the continent. In fact, if we did that in 2018 and developed that, perhaps with a bit of transfer of knowledge and skills from friendly countries such as China, we can actually expect the development and economic growth to even shoot up even faster in 2019-2020. But for now, just focusing on the period right ahead of us in 2018, one sees great opportunities. I think my concern is also what the concern that Professor Chege has expressed throughout this discussion, which is that the youth bulge and the youth dividend that we are not really putting to use as best as we perhaps could. This actually, the hindsight, the reverse of it is that we can actually be facing major problems if these youths become restive and go into violent mode, and then that can actually catch fire from one country to another. And before you know it, all these prospects that we're talking about might actually become political turmoil, because as we saw with the Arab Spring,
right.
An incident in one country can lead to similar incidents in other countries. So I think the bottom line of all this is focus on people, but particularly the youth, who comprise 60+% of the continent. But on the whole, I believe that we'll be looking at a better continent in terms of economic growth in 2018.
Right, gentlemen, we'll leave it there for today, and that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Johannesburg, Dr. Bob Wekesa, postdoctoral fellow at the University of the Witwatersrand, and with me in Nairobi, Professor Michael Chege, Professor of Public Policy and International Development at the University of Nairobi. Thank you for joining us on Talk Africa. Well, remember, you can continue this conversation with us through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and to join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, it's goodbye and happy 2018.